In this tutorial, we're going to look at genes and inheritance. Firstly, we're going to describe where genes are found and their function. Then we're going to describe what alleles are and how they affect the features we inherit, in fact, how they're inherited themselves. And then we're going to explain how we can inherit characteristics using genetic cross diagrams and look at a bit of pedigree analysis. To understand genes, we first have to understand DNA. I think it's fair to say that DNA is a fairly well-known molecule, but what's less known is how much we actually package away in our body. So let's start off with an amazing fact. The average human body is made up of about 10 trillion cells. Almost all of these cells contain DNA, which is packaged away in the nucleus. Now, if you unravel the DNA packaged away in a nucleus and stretched it out on a table in front of you, each nucleus would unravel to about 1.5 meters of DNA. So just to give this a very interesting context, if you unraveled every nucleus and every cell and stitched the DNA strands end to end, how far would it reach? Believe it or not, it would reach the moon and back about 800 times. That is a phenomenal amount of genetic information we are packaging away in our bodies. I guess the one conclusion you can draw from all this is DNA is incredibly important to us. And that's because DNA contains your genes. So what are genes? Genes carry information about specific characteristics. If you want to be more specific, one gene codes for one protein. You see, we have many molecules in our body, carbohydrates and proteins and fats, but it's the proteins we're made up of that basically account for all the differences we see when we look at different people around us. So DNA contains instructions to make proteins, and those proteins make us up. Some characteristics you can link to your genes directly are things like eye color, whether your earlobes are attached to your face or they're dangling down, your blood group, whether you're A, B or O or AB, and even taste buds. That's why some people find certain tastes pleasant and others find the same taste unpleasant. So don't go too hard on fussy eaters. The chances are it's got a lot to do with their genes. So first, it's incredibly important we understand where we find our genes. So this is a picture of a cell. Inside a cell, you'll find the nucleus. Now, if we zoom into the nucleus, you will find elongated structures called chromosomes. In your body, in every cell in your body, you have 46 chromosomes. So now, if we zoom into the chromosomes, you'll see that every chromosome is made from one molecule of DNA. DNA is made up of a sequence of 4 letters. You can see 4 different colours here to represent the letters. I'm not going to go into that now, that will be another tutorial. But the order of these letters basically instruct your body to develop different characteristics. Some parts of the DNA sequence don't seem to currently mean anything. Although perhaps by the time you're my age, scientists will unravel the mysteries of these mysterious non-coding regions. Other parts of the DNA sequence do mean something. They carry information to make specific proteins. We call these small sections of DNA a gene. So to recap, genes are small sections of DNA. One molecule of DNA makes up a chromosome. Chromosomes are found in the nucleus, and the nucleus is found in a cell. So this is how genetic information is organized in our body. Genes on chromosomes, chromosomes in the nucleus, and nucleus in a cell. So that is where genes are found, and their function in that they code for proteins covers AIM1. So now let's understand what alleles are and how they are inherited. So to understand alleles, let's first understand this analogy. Imagine I'm a computer programmer and I'm writing some code to draw a person on a screen. Now imagine my original code codes for red hair being drawn on the person. Now imagine that I email my code to make my redhead person to a friend. And what my friend has to do is just copy the code to replicate the person on their screen. But let's say while they're typing away, the phone rings and they get momentarily distracted. And this distraction causes them to make a slight error in the code. Most of the code is exactly the same, but a couple of lines have now changed. The effect of this distraction means that this person now has blonde hair. This illustrates what alleles are. Slight changes in the base sequence of a gene that causes the gene to be expressed in a slightly different way. So now let's apply this analogy to the real world context. Imagine this is the original gene we have and it codes for brown eyes. Now as organisms reproduce, they replicate their DNA to make copies. and these copies are passed on to the offspring. But over time, these copies aren't perfect. Sometimes mistakes happen. Some of these mistakes are made just naturally through the division process, but sometimes the environment affects DNA, such as radiation and mutagens. They can affect the base sequence of DNA. So over time, genes mutate slightly to produce new characteristics. For example, this base sequence you can see is slightly different. A mutation has occurred here, and the result is now we have blue eyes being expressed. As we continue over time, you can see now this DNA has mutated here, and now we're expressing green eyes. The information is largely the same, which is why all these genes will code for eye color. But due to these subtle changes, we now have different versions of the same gene which express slightly different characteristics. So alleles are different versions of a gene, of the same gene, and they're created through genetic mutation. We will always inherit two alleles for the same characteristic from our parents. Some alleles are referred to as dominant. This means inheriting one copy is enough for you to develop that characteristic. Dominant alleles are given a letter coding which is always capital. So big B, big R, big Q, big A. It can be any letter as long as the lowercase and the uppercase version look different. So you wouldn't use C because C looks too similar. Other alleles are said to be recessive. Here, you must inherit two copies of that allele to develop that characteristic. Recessive alleles are given the lowercase form of the letter, so small b, small r, small q, small a. Every characteristic you possess is determined by a combination of two alleles you will inherit from your parents. The combination of alleles or genes you inherit is called your genotype, and there are three types of genotype you need to be aware of. So two big Bs, if you inherit two dominant alleles, you would be referred to as homozygous dominant, so your genotype would be homozygous dominant. Remember that homo means the same, and zygous refers to the fertilized egg cell that you develop from. So inside that fertilized egg cell, you have two copies of the same dominant allele. You can also be homozygous recessive, and if you are, your genotype will be small b, or small letter, small letter. And finally, you can be heterozygous. That means you contain one dominant and one recessive allele for that characteristic. But if you are heterozygous, the dominant allele will suppress the effects of the recessive allele, so the dominant feature will express itself in your physical characteristics. So let's look at a cell in a bit more detail and look at the DNA inside. So here we are again inside the nucleus, and these coloured strands represent our chromosomes. Now I'm going to use a very cliche colour scheme here. Let's assume that the pink chromosomes are the chromosomes you inherit from your mother, and the blue chromosomes are those that you inherit from your father. You can see that each chromosome has its own pair. So if we analyse one pair, we can see that every locus, that means a specific point on the chromosome, we will find the same gene for the same characteristic on that part of the chromosome. So if the gene for eye colour was found on this chromosome, then if you find its partner or paired chromosome, the gene for eye colour will be found at exactly the same locus, same point. So both these genes will code for eye colour. However, this one contains a recessive version of the gene. This one contains a dominant version of the gene. So while the chromosomes contain the same gene, they actually carry different versions of the gene. So the dominant one here, recessive one here. So let's say the gene down here, for example, is to do with your earlobes, whether they're attached to your skin or dangle free. Now in this case, both genes, or both alleles rather, are recessive. So this person will be heterozygous for eye colour, but obviously this dominant one is the one that will be expressed in the phenotype, the way the person looks, and this person will be homozygous recessive for their earlobe feature. So how do we actually inherit alleles? Alleles are passed on to the offspring or other organisms through two mechanisms. Firstly, through sexual reproduction. So in every cell in your body, you contain 46 chromosomes, or rather 23 pairs, 23 from your mother, 23 from your father. Because you have two sets of chromosomes, we describe this as 2n. When our body produces our gametes, or sex cells, in other words sperm and egg, 23 of our chromosomes from our 46 gets packaged away into these gamete cells. So now you can see the sperm and the egg with their 23 chromosomes. We call this N because they only have one set. When the egg cell is fertilized by the sperm, the following happens. The nucleus of the sperm will enter the egg cell, not the sperm itself, and it will fuse with the nucleus of the egg cell. This means that the fertilized egg cell will now have 46 chromosomes, or two sets of chromosomes, two sets of 23 chromosomes. So remember, fertilization is when the nucleus of the sperm and the egg fuse to make a diploid. Diploid is our way of saying two sets of chromosomes. A diploid zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg cell. So diploid zygote. You can see why biologists make the best Scrabble players. So one way in which organisms inherit alleles is through sexual reproduction, but another way is through asexual reproduction. This is when there is only one parent involved, not two. Humans do not do this, but bacteria do. So you can see the full set of chromosomes is basically passed on to the new cells. So if you want to understand inheritance in a little bit more detail, this visual explanation should help. Now, to make this easier to understand, we're going to deal with just two pairs of chromosomes rather than 23. So in this example, we have a male nucleus and a female nucleus and the chromosomes inside. You can see that we have identical chromosomes, but the chromosomes carry different alleles for a characteristic. So when sperm and egg are made, only half of each pair will be passed on to the sex cell. So let's have a look. So let's say when this male produces its sperm cell, this chromosome is passed or packaged into the sperm, and let's say this chromosome is packaged into the sperm. Whereas when this female produces her egg cell, let's say this chromosome is packaged, and let's say this chromosome. So when the egg is fertilized, you end up with these chromosome pairs. Okay, please also don't assume that these remain in the nucleus. These will be packaged into other sex cells. So let's say in this example, the letter A represents eye colour, where brown is the dominant allele, and B is for hairstyle, where curly hair is dominant. So you can see here that this baby has inherited two dominant alleles for eye colour. In other words, they are homozygous dominant and they will have brown eyes, whereas they've basically inherited two recessive alleles for hairstyle, and because curly hair is dominant, they must have straight hair. So their genotype for eye colour is homozygous dominant, and their genotype for hairstyle is homozygous recessive. Now let's imagine it's the other chromosomes that were packaged into the sperm and egg. So let's move them across. And now let's fertilise the egg. So now you can see something slightly different. This baby will be heterozygous for eye colour because they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele, so they're heterozygous. They will still have brown eyes because they've inherited one copy of the dominant allele. Now if we look at hairstyle, they're again heterozygous, so they have one copy of the recessive allele, which is for straight hair, and one copy of the dominant allele for curly hair. But because curly hair is dominant, the baby will grow to have curly hair. So hopefully that helps you understand how we inherit characteristics through sexual reproduction. If you're an asexually reproducing bacteria, it's much simpler. In fact, bacteria have, rather than strands of chromosomes, they have one large loop called circular DNA, where all the chromosomes are found on that loop. So when the bacteria reproduces asexually, it just produces a clone of itself with exactly the same alleles. This is why there's much less variation through asexual reproduction when compared to sexual reproduction. So that explains what alleles are, different versions of a gene, and how they affect the features we inherit through understanding whether they are dominant or recessive. That's aim 2 done. So now let's look at genetic cross diagrams, which help us understand how we inherit alleles in a very simplistic way. Really nice, easy marks in an exam if you get a genetic cross diagram to perform. So to do this, we're going to look at three features. The first one is the disease cystic fibrosis, then sickle cell anemia, which is another disease, and then polydactyly, which is a condition where someone has developed an extra finger or toe. Cystic fibrosis is a very serious condition where the sufferer will produce very thick mucus which is very hard to shift within the body. That affects our breathing as this thick mucus lines our lungs. It impairs digestion as the thick mucus lines our gut and blocks the pancreas from releasing digestive enzymes. And because it also lines our reproductive tracts, it can make us sterile. It's a European disease and it affects about 1 in 25,000 Europeans, but it's also recessive. In other words, you'll need 2 copies of the recessive allele to inherit cystic fibrosis. Sickle cell anemia is a disease which causes a production of sickle-shaped red blood cells rather than normal sort of flat discs. Because they are sickle-shaped, the cells are deprived of oxygen. They cannot carry as much oxygen, so less oxygen is delivered to cells for respiration. As a result, we have less energy, so we are tired. We can develop painful joints and muscles, and it can also result in fever. If you have sickle cell anemia, the chances are you will not survive very long. It's also a recessive feature and affects largely African people. And just for the sake of showing you a dominant feature, we'll look at polydactyly, as I said, where you develop extra fingers or toes. So it's a dominant feature, so you only need 1 copy of the allele to develop that characteristic. So whenever you perform a genetic cross, you must lay it out like this, with parents first, then the phenotype, the feature the parents possess, then the genotype, the combination of alleles which the parents have inside their nucleus for that feature, then the gametes, the sex cells they produce, then finally the genetic cross, after which we interpret the data to get the expected phenotype ratio. In other words, what are the chances that the baby will develop certain characteristics. It becomes very easy once you work through it. So let's say we have a female carrier of cystic fibrosis and an affected male. Carrier is a term we give to someone who possesses 1 copy of the recessive allele, but they're not actually affected by the disease. We only use the term carrier when we're describing disease-based genetic conditions. You wouldn't say, for example, that someone was a carrier of blue eyes, but you could say carrier of cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. So, as carriers are heterozygous, this is the genotype of the female. I'm going to use the letter coding Q. So 1 big Q for 1 dominant and 1 small q. The male is affected, so it's a recessive disease, so they must have 2 copies of the recessive allele, small q, small q. This means that they can produce gametes or 2 types of gametes, one which has a big Q packaged in it, and the female can also produce one with a small q, whereas the male can only produce 1 type of gamete, which is one with a small q in it, recessive. Now you set up your cross diagram. It doesn't matter which side you put the male features on or the female features on. So I'm going to put the female features on the left side. So big Q here, because that's 1 type of egg they can produce, and small q here. And for the male, small q here, small q here. So these represent the different types of gametes they can produce. So if this sperm fertilizes this egg, this is the genotype we'll get. Big Q, small q, so this person will be heterozygous, and you just keep on doing this. Big Q, small q, small q, small q, small q, small q. So now we can work out the probability of the baby inheriting a certain characteristic. So we can see there's a 50% chance that they'll be heterozygous, a carrier of cystic fibrosis, and a 50% chance they'll actually have the disease. In other words, there's a 2-to-2 ratio of carrier to affected probability, or you can simplify that to 1-to-1 ratio. If ratios confuse you, just use percentages. 50% chance of being a carrier, 50% chance of being affected by cystic fibrosis. Now let's look at sickle cell disease. Let's say that in this example, the female and the male are both carriers. So that obviously means that sickle cell is a recessive disease. So they will have the following genotype. We'll use H for this one. So there'll be 1 dominant, 1 recessive, 1 dominant, 1 recessive. That means each produce 2 different types of gametes, 1 with a dominant allele, 1 with a recessive one, 1 with a dominant, 1 with a recessive. So now let's play the cross forward. So let's see what a genetic cross diagram gets us. Here we have 2 dominants, so homozygous dominant, heterozygous here, and homozygous recessive. So last time I used ratios, this time just for a change I'll show you percentages. So we have a 25% chance, 1 in 4, that the baby will be normal. We have a 50% chance that they'll be a carrier, and a 25% chance they'll be affected. Remember, this only shows you probability. I mean, they could have many children, then all be normal, but it's unlikely if you look at the probability. So now let's look at the dominant condition of polydactyly. Now in this case, the female is normal, she has a normal 5-digit hand, and therefore she must be recessive, or rather homozygous recessive. I'm going to use R for this one. So small r, small r. The male is affected. That means they can either be heterozygous or homozygous dominant. I'm going to choose homozygous dominant for this one. So big R, big R. Now we have to form the gametes, so there's only one type of gamete both produce, one with small r for the female, one with big R for the male. So now let's set up the cross, and you might be able to predict what's going to happen here. Big R, small r, big R, small r, big R, small r, and big R, small r. So in other words, as all outcomes are heterozygous, that means there's a 100% chance of the offspring, the baby, being born with a condition. Remember, it's a dominant condition, so this is the allele which gives you that characteristic, and every single genotype contains one copy of the dominant allele. These are really easy, but definitely practice makes perfect. Finally, we're going to look at pedigree analysis. This is used to interpret family trees. Every pedigree analysis you will get a key. The key normally looks something like this. You have a square for a male, a female will be a circle. If they're affected by a condition, they'll be shaded in square, shaded in circle for affected female. And sometimes they give you information about carriers as well, which will be half shaded and half unshaded. So this is what a pedigree shows us. You can see there are two parents here, male and female here, who have reproduced. That's what the connecting line means. And here are their children. Here's one, here's another, male, female, brother and sister. But this person is married from outside the family. That's why they don't stem off the parents. And then these two have had children, and you can see one female, one non-female, and a male. Now with pedigree, I always recommend writing the letter codes for the ones you can work out. So you know this person is normal, so they'll be, I'll use Q here, so they're going to be big Q, big Q. Whereas this person's affected, so they'll be small q, small q. If an affected and non-affected person reproduce, all the children will be heterozygous, because they'll inherit one big copy and one small copy. So you can label away. Big Q, small q. They will all be carriers, but they won't be affected themselves. But this is important information because you may want to genetically test the person you're going to marry and have children with to look at the chances of your children inheriting that condition, because it's a very serious disorder and will certainly change your lives as parents. So in this example, you can see you can get a complete mix of different alleles. You can have big Q combining with another big Q. You could have big Q combining with a small q, or you could have a small q combining with a small q. So heterozygotes will always give you the biggest variety in the offspring for a characteristic. This is definitely the most popular problem-solving exercise they give you in an exam. Sometimes they don't give you a key for carriers, and instead you just have blank squares and circles. So they may ask you, using evidence from the pedigree, how can you tell what genotype these parents are? If you're experienced at this, you'll know instantly if it's something like a recessive disorder like cystic fibrosis, these parents must be heterozygous. That explains, it's the only way that you can explain that these parents aren't affected by the disease, but they've produced children who are. And that is how we inherit characteristics using genetic cross diagrams.